Hi, everyone. I'm getting ready to read chapter 2 of Jip to you. Remember yesterday, Catherine Patterson, the author, kind of introduced us to many of the characters in the book in the first chapter. So we, of course, met Jip. We learned a little bit about his story. We met the other residents of the town poor farm, including Sheldon, who has a mind of a young child, but is very, very strong. And Jip is a very good friend of his. And then, of course, we met Mr. and Mrs. Lyman, who Mr. Lyman is the manager of the town poor farm, and Mr. Flint, Overseer Flint, who is the person from town who's in charge of sending money or keeping money from the town poor farm. And remember, at the end of the last chapter, Jip and Sheldon were given the job of building a cage, a strong cage for the lunatic, the man who is to arrive at the farm. So today's chapter 2, is called The Lunatic. Jip put the straw mattress Mrs. Lyman had made on one side of the cage, sat down, and pulled shut the slat door. He wanted to know how it might feel to live in a cage. There was a chamber pot in the corner. That would be if you were in a cage and you couldn't go to the bathroom, you would use a chamber pot. He had made a little trap door so it could be taken out and emptied, and food could be passed in without having to undo the padlock on the main entry. He looked about, taking in the smell of the new shaved wood. He and Sheldon had done a good job of it. It felt clean and, well, cozy. It might be nice to have a place of his own like this, away from the snoring of the old men and Sheldon's tossing and restless sleep talk. Well, at least he had a cot of his own now. At first he'd had to sleep with Sheldon, and woke up on the floor more mornings than not. He supposed he'd have slept on the floor the rest of his days, but a lucky thing happened. A year back, old man Rutherford died, and Jip grabbed the vacant cot before Mrs. Lyman had time even to wash out the raggedy quilt. So old man Rutherford was another person who lived at the town poor farm, and when he died, Jip grabbed his bed before Mrs. Lyman could even wash the quilt on it. He stretched out on the mattress. The straw pricked through the ticking in his thin shirt and breeches, but it smelled fresh, unlike his own musty bed. So right now he's lying on the mattress in the cage. The plank floor of the cage was no harder than the wooden frame of his cot. He sucked in a deep, satisfied breath, gazing up at the strips of wood that he and Sheldon had nailed across the top. Mr. Lyman had grumbled about the waste of nails, which came dear at a penny apiece, but the overseer had demanded that they triple nail each end of every slat. It was like looking at the ceiling through an elaborate fence. The sides, the same crisscrossed pattern as the top, felt like a protection. He couldn't ever remember having privacy. Even at Slater's he had slept in the same room as the farmer. Privacy, or the desire for it, was not an idea that he could put into words. But in the cage he sensed what it might feel like to have a little space all one's own that no other, not even simple sweet Sheldon or his beloved animals, would intrude upon. "Jip! Jip!" The boy sighed and left the comfort of the cage to respond to Mrs. Lyman's cry. What he needed was a cage with walls so thick that he wouldn't be able to hear the constant call of his name. They brought the lunatic that very afternoon. Once more the residents stood shivering in the April chill, watching a horse wagon come up the road. This time neither Jip nor Sheldon was sent to help. Unlike the gig, this wagon was pulled by a strong team of Morgans, which are horses, and besides the driver and the overseer on the front seat, 4 sturdy townsmen sat at the corners of the wagon bed surrounding a strange, bent-over figure whose screams could be heard long before any face or recognizable human form came into focus. "Jesus Crow!" old Joe exclaimed, revealing that even a man half-deaf could hear the commotion. Sheldon clamped both hands over his ears and squeezed his eyes shut, trying to keep out the terrifying sound. When at last the wagon pulled into the yard, Jip could see that the strange form in the center of the wagon bed was a man with only his head free. A rope wound about his legs and back, bringing his knees to his chest. His arms were around his legs, and his huge, gnarled hands were tied together at the wrists. The rough hemp rope had rubbed the flesh raw, and between his shrieks he would duck his shaggy head to bite at the rope with large yellow teeth. The hair was appalling, long as a woman's, but it seemed all of a piece with his beard, both of which were streaked with gray and dotted with spittle. So his hair is long and kind of wild, and his beard is just part of his hair. Sheldon opened his eyes long enough to take in the sight, then grabbed Jip's arm in terror. "It's all right, Sheldon," Jip whispered. "I won't let him hurt you," which was the emptiest promise he'd ever made. The man looked quite determined to burst his bonds and do damage to the whole lot of them. The 4 townsmen jumped off the back of the wagon before the driver had halted the team. They were all shouting orders, but the yells of the overseer, in his gardening clothes instead of his frock coat, were louder than even the ravings of the lunatic. "Carry it to the cage!" 2 of the townsmen were up on the wagon, trying to shove the lunatic over the side to the other 2. It couldn't be done. They called for help, so Jip disentangled himself from Sheldon's anxious grasp and scrambled up to help them lift the trussed creature over the side like a bag of rocks into the arms of the men below. So a trussed creature's one that's all tied up. They swayed almost to their knees, cursing at the weight. Then shoving, pushing, and stumbling, they carried him into the house, Mrs. Lyman scurrying ahead to open the doors and the overseer shouting out orders. The lunatic, with all his limbs secured, squirmed and bleated like a hog set for the slaughter. The men dragged and dumped him in the cage, tripping over the madman's body in their hurry to escape. Mr. Flint slammed the door, clamped the great iron padlock together with a clunk of metal, and turned to present the key to Mr. Lyman. The manager's wide eyes were so fixed on the lunatic that it was several moments and a jab before he saw the key to take it. "Mind you, take care, Lyman," the overseer said to the manager, who was visibly shaking. "I hold you responsible." The escorts did not even stay for the cups of hard cider that Mrs. Lyman had poured out earlier. They hurried to the wagon and left the farm as fast as the horses could take them down the muddy track. "Well," said Mrs. Lyman, downing a cup of cider, "waste not, want not. Waste not, want not." She handed a cup to her husband, who, without a word, hastily downed 2 more. Between them, they finished off the 6 cups prepared for the visitors, while the thirsty residents stood by, licking their dry lips. So Mr. and Mrs. Lyman drank all the cider that she had poured out for the visitors. Not the visitors, the people who had brought the man to the farm. All but Jip, who, seeing the Lymans occupied, stole the butcher knife and crept back to the room next to the shed where the old lunatic lay. His shrieks had quieted to rhythmic moans. "Shh, shh, hush there," Jip said. "Hush, old fella. We ain't going to hurt you." For a moment the groaning ceased, and the old man struggled about to fix his bloodshot gaze toward the bars where Jip knelt, crooning. "Can you roll yourself to the side?" the boy asked softly, "or just swing close enough for me to cut them ropes for you?" He spoke in the voice he used for Sheldon and George and the poor dumb beasts in his care. Miraculously, the lunatic seemed to understand. With an enormous lunge, he heaved his body against the slats. The trick was to get the rope cut without giving the lunatic a chance to grab the knife. Sweat stood out on Jip's forehead as he eased the blade through the slats and under the ropes across the man's back. He crooned as he sawed at the ropes. There, it'll be better soon. There, that's the main one. A minute more and I'll have your ankles free." The lunatic stretched out his cramped limbs, crying a bit with the pain of it. "Now, can you just move around to the front?" The man hesitated, trying to unravel the request. "Come close, here, to me. Stick those old hands through the slats. Then I can cut loose your wrists, too." He put his own wrists together, trying to signal to the man what was needed. The lunatic shuffled about on his knees, then stretched out his bound hands. He could barely squeeze them through the slats. He flinched slightly as Jip worked the blade between his wrists. "Steady now, quiet. I'd be loath to slice you instead of the rope." The lunatic obeyed. A little dog-like whimper had replaced the moans. Jip smiled. "See, it's near cut through now. You'll feel lots better without this rope grazing your poor old flesh. There, see?" The man pulled his hands back into the cage, turning them over as if to study them. Maybe I should get you some ointment to put on those rope burns. Want I should do that? The man nodded, rubbing first one sore wrist, then the other. His lips parted, showing his great yellow teeth. At first Jip was startled. It took him a moment to understand. The lunatic was smiling. Jip smiled back, shyly at first, but as the lunatic's smile broadened, so did his own. There, he said. Well, I got to fetch the ointment. Don't fuss while I'm gone, old fella. I won't be long. What are you doing with my knife? Mrs. Lyman was a bit tipsy from her 2 cups of cider, which she had downed too fast for a woman unaccustomed to fermented drinks. So fermented drinks are drinks that have drinks that have become alcohol after they have fermented for a while, sat for a while. If you ever get a jug of cider and you leave it in your refrigerator and forget about it, when you drink it later, you might it might taste different, like have a little different tang to it because it's fermented. Let's see. So what are you doing with my knife? I figured Mr. Lyman would want me to cut the lunatic loose. That poor fellow trussed up like a pig ready to be stuck. It weren't human to leave him so. He's hardly human, that one, she said. I need some ointment. The rope has rubbed his wrist to bleeding. She fetched the ointment from her cabinet of assorted medications. It was right behind the medicinal spirits. You ain't afraid of the creature? She asked, her back still to the boy. He shrugged. What was the answer? Maybe he was and maybe he wasn't. He only knew the lunatic needed to have his limbs loosed and his wounds attended to. I don't figure he'll take unkind to having his wrists soothed. She turned then and gave him a look before she continued in a sterner tone. Well, don't forget you've got chores to attend to, she said. They don't stop just 'cause you found yourself a new pet. I won't, he said and sighed. That was how he had acquired responsibility for all the Jip's livestock and neediest residents. They were Jip's pets, which out of the goodness of the manager's heart the boy was allowed to care for. The cage room was quiet when Jip pushed open the door. He wished he'd scrubbed down the walls after he'd carried all the years of trash out of it yesterday. It seemed so dark in the small room. A high north window let in little light, and the soot on the walls, evidence of the faulty fireplace, made the room even more dingy. The cage filled more than half the space. Beside it there was no furniture. It was a gloomy place to spend one's days. The lunatic was lying stretched out on his mattress. It was too short for him, so his feet hung off the end. The man was staring at the slats, which patterned his view of the cracked ceiling plaster. How came I here? He asked without moving his head. What? Jip would have been less startled to hear Bible verses coming from old Bonnie's bovine muzzle. Remember, old Bonnie is the cow? So it surprised him when the man spoke normally. How came I into this cage? His words were clear, no relation to the ravings of a lunatic. You was carried here, sir, on Mr. Flint's wagon. The overseer of the poor, Mr. Flint? Yes, sir. And does Mr. Flint aim to keep me in a cage like some beast from the jungle? The boy hung his head, ashamed to be one of those who had carried the man in here. You was raving, sir, something wild and mad. I reckon it was for your safety. The man sighed deeply and sat up to face him. I brung you ointment, sir, for your wrists. The rope scraped them something awful. Again the man raised his hands, turning them over to examine the wounds as though he'd forgotten. If you'll stick them through the slats, I can rub some of this on them, soothe them a bit. His voice went up into a question, as if addressing an elder whose preferences must now be consulted. So I read that wrong. Let me read that again. If you stick them through the slats, I can rub some of this on them, soothe them up a bit? He's asking, politely. The man stuck one large hand through the slats. You're a kind young feller. What's your name? Jip, sir. My friends used to call me Putt, the old man said. I'd like it if you'd call me Putt. It's for Putnam, but that's too grand a name for the likes of me, don't you think? Jip grinned. Putt's nice, he said. Why Jip? Mr. Lyman dubbed me Jip, he said, gently massaging the cold ointment into the raw flesh, on account of I fell off the back of a wagon, and some says it was a gypsy wagon. I see. Jip pulled the left hand back and thrust out the right. This is the town farm, then? Yes, sir. He was a little sorry to be the one to give such news. To save you from being sent to the asylum, it was. The man didn't remark on that, and Jip decided not to say that the cage was the town's way of saving taxpayer money. The man's plight was harsh enough. I don't reckon, the man began. I don't reckon they'd let me take a bath, or, he laughed shortly, or trim my hair and beard. Likely not. Jip kept his head over his task, avoiding the man's eyes. They're a bit jumpy yet. You just got here less than an hour ago. Maybe when you settle in more. There. Does that ease it some? The man pulled back his hand. It does. You're a good lad. Can you make it one more favor? A wet cloth to wipe my face? Before the week was out, Jip had cajoled Mr. Lyman into letting him fill a tub in Putt's room so the man could bathe. And although no one, not even Jip, wanted to hand over a straight razor, Jip was allowed scissors to cut Putt's wild growth of hair and beard to a more becoming human length. Do you like a pleasing tune, my boy? I don't know. I'm not much for music. All I ever heard was hymns in church, and most of them is pretty drear, meaning not very happy. The man began to sing then. He had a high voice, clear like sleigh bells across the snow. As the days passed, Jip came to know that song well, for Putt would sing it over and over, never tiring of either the melody or the words. Sometimes Jip would try to sing along, all is well, though his own voice sounded scratchy and tuneless compared to the lunatic's sweet song. In truth, Jip could scarcely call Putt a lunatic. He was not an unhandsome man when bathed, his clothes scrubbed by Jip, his hair and beard neat. His eyes had quite lost their bloodshot wildness. Putt's lunacy had fled or been cast into some distant swine like in the Bible tale. Every night Jip longed to leave the cage unlocked, for it made his heart sick to clap a padlock against his newfound friend. You daren't leave it open, boy, Putt said. If I go raving in the night, I can't think what harm this wretched mind might betray me to. So Putt recognizes that sometimes his mind is not safe, and so he makes sure that Jip does lock him in. So reluctantly, Jip slammed the padlock shackle into its case and hung the key in the medicine cabinet behind the medicinal spirits. Then, without warning one night, the house awoke to shrieks and terrible banging. Jip threw on his breeches and raced down the stairs, his suspenders flying. Putt, Putt, he cried, to make himself heard over the din. But his friend paid no heed to his pleading and hurled his body against the slats until Jip felt sure he would tear all the nails from their holes and splinter the rock maple timbers into kindling. Putt, Putt, he murmured, half crying out his friend's name. There's no one here would harm you. Rest, rest, hush. Don't punish your poor self so. In answer, Putt tore at his face until the blood ran and soiled his shirt. The Lymans and the residents, all in their night clothes, stood about in the hallway, terrified to cross the threshold. Only Jip dared approach the cage, but even he stood back lest the lunatic's great hand dart out at him through the slats. Come back, Jip crooned. Don't let the devil possess you. Come back. It's me, your old friend Jip, what you sings and talks to. Jip sat on the cold floor, clasped his hands about his knees, and began to sing. This is from the song that Putt likes to sing. I soon shall be from every pain and sorrow free. I shall the King of glory see. All is well, all is well. He sang until his throat was hoarse, not loud. He knew that he could not sing above the lunatic's threats and curses. But rocking his body, he sang on to comfort himself. He had the vain hope that somewhere in that terrible head, behind those fearful teeth, a bit of the Putt he cared for was still alive, and could hear that Jip was near and would not desert him. At some point, well past daylight, both the madman and the boy fell into exhausted sleep. Jip was awakened by Mrs. Lyman's call from the hallway. He must get his lazy self to the barn and milk, she said. He stole away from the huge form lying crammed into a corner of the cage, splattered with blood and spittle, and worse. Spittle is what comes out of your mouth sometimes when you spit. Or even when you talk sometimes, you don't mean it to. Old Bonnie welcomed him with a gentle low and a barely impatient stomp of her back hoof. I know, my darling, he said sorrowfully. I'm late and causing you discomfort. But how could I leave him? And then he pulled the stool closer and rested his head against her warm flank, her side. And then I fell asleep. He began the rhythmic stroking of her teats, and as the milk plinked into the waiting pail, he remembered his sad and desperate singing in the night. He had found a beast he couldn't tame at will. It was like to break his young heart. And that is the end of chapter 2. So we've come to know that Putt is not always a raving lunatic, that much of the time he is a calm and kind and intelligent man. But he himself knows that sometimes his mind is not under his control. And at the end of this chapter was an incident when it was not. And Jip, who loves every animal and all the people, makes them his pets, as Mr. and Mrs. Lyman say, just so that he'll have to take care of them. Jip realizes that there is someone in his life now that he cannot soothe and tame, and it makes him very, very sad. Okay, that's chapter 2. If there was any part of that you didn't understand, any words you want me to explain, make sure to send me a message and I will do so. All right? Chapter 3 will come later.